She spoke 9 languages when most rulers could barely manage their native tongue. She was one of the most brilliant mathematicians of her age. Yet history remembers her primarily as a seductress. She ruled the richest kingdom in the Mediterranean for nearly 2 decades. And when she died at 39, she took with her 3 centuries of Ptolemaic rule and the last remnants of Alexander the Great's empire. This is the story of Cleopatra VII, the final pharaoh of Egypt, whose life contained more political intrigue, impossible romance, and sheer ambition than the most daring novelist would dare invent. Tonight, we'll witness her ruthless rise through palace conspiracies and civil war, her legendary alliances with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony that changed the course of history, and her final gamble to save both her throne and her civilization from Roman conquest. We'll explore the glittering corruption of Alexandria's royal court, the brutal realities of ancient power politics, and the propaganda war that reduced this brilliant strategist to an exotic temptress in Roman minds. You'll discover how a young woman born into a dying dynasty managed to make Rome's greatest generals bow to her will, and why her death didn't just end Egypt's independence, it gave birth to the Roman Empire itself. As you settle in for this journey, you'll understand why Cleopatra's name has echoed through 2 millennia, and why the woman behind the legend was far more fascinating than any Hollywood myth. From the marble halls of Alexandria to the blood-soaked waters of Actium, from passionate nights on the Nile to a final meeting with an asp, this is a story of love and war, of East meeting West, and of one woman's impossible dream to hold back the tide of Roman ambition. Thank you for joining me on this epic journey through ancient history's most captivating reign. Please let me know in the comments where you're listening from tonight. I love hearing from viewers around the world, and if you enjoy these deep dives into history's remarkable figures, a subscription would truly help this channel grow and bring you more stories that deserve to be remembered. Now settle back for a tale of gods and mortals, of queens and emperors, of a love affair that shook the ancient world. Let's begin where her story truly starts, with her birth in 69 BCE into the Ptolemaic dynasty, the most brilliantly dysfunctional royal family in history, and the impossible crown that would define every breathtaking moment of her legendary life. In the winter of 69 BCE, as Alexandria's marble palaces gleamed under the Egyptian sun, a child was born who would become the last pharaoh of Egypt. Cleopatra VII Philopator entered the world not as a hopeful beginning, but as what many believed would be the final chapter of a dynasty that had ruled Egypt for nearly 3 centuries. She was born into the Ptolemaic line, the last of Alexander the Great's successors, Macedonian Greeks who had claimed Egypt as their prize when the great conqueror's empire fractured. But by Cleopatra's birth, the Ptolemies were living relics, Greek pharaohs ruling over an Egypt that Rome increasingly saw as its personal granary and piggy bank. To understand Cleopatra, you must first understand her spectacularly dysfunctional family. The Ptolemies had turned family dysfunction into an art form that would make modern soap opera writers weep with envy. Their solution to keeping power concentrated was elegantly simple and thoroughly disturbing. Marry your siblings. For 300 years, brothers married sisters, uncles married nieces, and occasionally, just to keep things interesting, someone would murder a relative who got too ambitious. Cleopatra's great-great-grandmother, Cleopatra III, had 2 sons fight a civil war over who got to marry her. Their own mother, her great-grandfather, Ptolemy III, was briefly married to his sister, his niece, and possibly his daughter, though ancient record-keeping makes family trees rather difficult to untangle when everyone has the same 5 names. The Ptolemaic family motto might as well have been keeping it in the family since 305 BCE. But this wasn't just peculiar royal eccentricity. It was calculated political strategy. Every marriage outside the family meant sharing power with outsiders, and the Ptolemies had not survived 3 centuries by being generous with their authority. Of course, 3 centuries of inbreeding had also produced a few pharaohs who spoke to their horses and declared war on the Mediterranean Sea, but that was apparently considered an acceptable trade-off. Into this world of marble palaces and murderous relatives came young Cleopatra, and from her earliest years, it was clear she had inherited the family intelligence without the family insanity. While her siblings played with toys, Cleopatra was learning languages. By the time most children were struggling with basic arithmetic, She was debating philosophy with Alexandria's greatest scholars. Her education was nothing short of extraordinary. The Ptolemies, whatever their personal failings, had always prized learning, and Alexandria remained the intellectual capital of the Mediterranean world. The great library, though diminished from its peak, still housed more knowledge than existed anywhere else on earth. Cleopatra studied mathematics with the heirs of Euclid, rhetoric with masters trained in Athens, and statecraft with advisors who had served her grandfather and great-grandfather. But it was languages that truly set her apart. While most Ptolemaic rulers never bothered to learn Egyptian, content to rule over their subjects without speaking to them, Cleopatra mastered not just Egyptian, but Hebrew, Arabic, Ethiopian, and several other African dialects. She spoke Greek like the cultured aristocrat she was, Latin like a Roman senator, and could apparently switch between languages mid-conversation to make political points that left foreign ambassadors scrambling to keep up. Ancient historians tell us she was the first Ptolemaic ruler in 3 centuries who could actually speak to her Egyptian subjects in their own language. This wasn't just impressive linguistics, it was revolutionary politics. For the first time in 300 years, Egypt had a pharaoh who saw herself as truly Egyptian, not just a Greek occupier sitting on an ancient throne. Her father, Ptolemy XII, known somewhat unkindly as Ides, the flute player, because of his musical obsessions, provided Cleopatra with a masterclass in political survival. Ides was not a strong king by traditional standards, but he was a cunning one. When he was driven from Egypt by angry subjects who resented his Roman-friendly policies, he didn't sulk in exile. He went to Rome and essentially bought his throne back with promises of tribute and loyalty. Watching her father grovel before Roman senators while plotting his return taught young Cleopatra invaluable lessons about power, pride, and pragmatism. Sometimes survival meant swallowing your dignity. Sometimes it meant making deals with people you despised. And sometimes it meant smiling graciously while planning their eventual downfall. The Egypt of Cleopatra's youth was a kingdom caught between worlds. Alexandria remained magnificent. Its lighthouse still counted among the wonders of the world. Its scholars still produced mathematical and astronomical works that amazed contemporary Greeks and Romans. The city's museums, theaters, and libraries attracted intellectuals from across the Mediterranean. Artists, philosophers, mathematicians, and merchants made Alexandria a cosmopolitan jewel that outshone even Rome in cultural sophistication. But this renaissance existed on increasingly shaky foundations. Egypt's wealth, legendary since the time of the pharaohs, was being steadily drained by Roman tribute demands. The kingdom that had once been so rich it could afford to build pyramids was now struggling to pay its protection money to Roman generals, who treated Egypt as their personal cash machine. Young Cleopatra absorbed all of this, the glory and the decay, the brilliance and the desperation. She watched foreign merchants grow rich off Egyptian grain, while Egyptian farmers struggled with debt. She saw Roman advisors treated with more deference than Egyptian nobles. She witnessed her father's careful balance between maintaining royal dignity and appeasing Roman demands. Most importantly, she learned that intelligence without power was merely academic exercise, but power without intelligence was a guarantee of disaster. The Ptolemaic tombs were full of rulers who had possessed one but not the other. As she entered her teenage years, it became clear that Cleopatra was different from her siblings. While her younger brother Ptolemy XIII showed promise as a traditional ruler, comfortable with advisors making decisions and content with ceremonial duties, Cleopatra displayed an appetite for real power that made her father's counselors nervous and her brother's supporters deeply uncomfortable. She didn't just study languages, she used them to speak directly with ship captains, merchants, and common soldiers, bypassing the traditional court hierarchy. She didn't just learn mathematics, she applied it to calculating tax revenues and trade routes. She didn't just memorize philosophy, she used it to craft arguments that left seasoned diplomats speechless. By the time Ptolemy XII lay dying in 51 BCE, it was clear that Egypt was about to crown its most capable ruler in generations. It was also clear that capability and survival were not the same thing, and that the most dangerous thing Cleopatra could be was exactly what she was becoming: too intelligent, too ambitious, and too Egyptian for her own good. The stage was set for a confrontation that would determine not just who ruled Egypt, but whether Egypt would remain an independent kingdom or become another Roman province. The dying king's legacy to his brilliant daughter was a crown, a kingdom, and an impossible choice: bow to Rome and preserve some semblance of independence, or resist and risk losing everything. Cleopatra, 18 years old and already fluent in the language of power, chose a third option that no one saw coming. She would make Rome bow to her. When Ptolemy XII died in the spring of 51 BCE, 18-year-old Cleopatra inherited more than just a crown. She inherited 3 centuries of tradition that demanded she share it with her 10-year-old brother, Ptolemy XIII. According to Ptolemaic custom, the new pharaoh must marry their closest male relative and rule jointly, because apparently, after watching their family tree turn into more of a family wreath over the centuries, the Ptolemies had decided that their system was working perfectly and shouldn't be changed. The marriage was, thankfully, ceremonial rather than consummated. Even by Ptolemaic standards, waiting for your co-ruler to reach puberty was considered good form, but the political implications were immediately clear. Cleopatra might be the senior partner in this arrangement, but she would never rule alone. Every decision, every decree, every policy would officially come from Cleopatra and Ptolemy XIII, beloved of the gods, rulers of the 2 lands. For someone who had spent her entire education preparing to wield real power, this was like being handed the keys to a chariot, and then being told she had to let a 10-year-old hold the reins. The early months of their joint reign revealed just how incompatible this arrangement would be. Cleopatra approached ruling like the brilliant administrator she was, diving into tax records, meeting with merchants, personally reviewing grain shipments, and conducting diplomacy in whatever language would be most effective. She treated the throne not as an ornament, but as a tool for governing Egypt's complex affairs. Ptolemy XIII, guided by his advisors, approached ruling like the ceremonial figurehead they wanted him to be. He was content to sit through religious rituals, wave at crowds during festivals, and let experienced counselors handle the messy details of actual governance. For a 10-year-old, this was perfectly reasonable behavior. For a co-pharaoh of Egypt during one of its most precarious periods, it was a recipe for disaster. The real power behind Ptolemy XIII lay with his 3 primary advisors: the eunuch Pothinus, who served as chief minister, the general Achilles, who commanded the royal army, and Arsinoe IV, Cleopatra's younger sister, who was already positioning herself as an alternative to both siblings. This triumvirate had a simple goal: use the boy king as their puppet, while gradually marginalizing his brilliant older sister, who had inconvenient ideas about actually ruling. Their first major clash came over economic policy. Egypt was facing its worst crisis in decades. The Nile's annual flood had been insufficient for 3 consecutive years, leading to poor harvests and rising grain prices. Roman tribute demands remained constant despite Egypt's reduced circumstances, creating a fiscal nightmare that required immediate attention and careful management. Cleopatra's solution was characteristically direct: reduce tribute payments to Rome while increasing trade with other Mediterranean powers to compensate for agricultural shortfalls. She proposed renegotiating several Roman agreements, pointing out that a bankrupt Egypt would serve no one's interests. Her analysis was mathematically sound, politically astute, and completely terrifying to advisors who remembered what happened to rulers who disappointed Rome. Ptolemy XIII's advisors preferred a more traditional approach: raise taxes on Egyptian subjects, maintain Roman payments at all costs, and hoped the Nile would return to normal flooding patterns soon. This was certainly the safer political option, and it had the added benefit of keeping Roman generals happy while making the boy king appear appropriately deferential to their powerful neighbor. The fundamental disagreement revealed a deeper philosophical divide about Egypt's future. Cleopatra saw herself as pharaoh of Egypt first, with obligations to Roman allies second. Her advisors saw Egypt as a Roman client state that happened to maintain local customs, and they believed survival depended on never forgetting which relationship took priority. As 50 BCE progressed into 49 BCE, these policy disagreements evolved into open hostility. Cleopatra began making unilateral decisions, issuing decrees in her name alone, and conducting meetings with foreign ambassadors, without including her brother's representatives. She was, in effect, attempting to rule as a sole pharaoh while maintaining the fiction of joint rule. This might have worked if she had controlled the military, but General Achilles commanded the loyalty of Alexandria's garrison and most of Egypt's professional soldiers. These men had served under Ptolemy XII and were comfortable with traditional power structures. They respected Cleopatra's intelligence, but were deeply uncomfortable with a female ruler who seemed intent on confronting Rome rather than accommodating it. The final break came in early 48 BCE, triggered by an incident that perfectly captured the absurdity of their situation. A Roman grain merchant had complained to both rulers about delayed payments, submitting his petition to each throne separately. Cleopatra approved immediate payment from emergency reserves. Ptolemy XIII's advisors rejected the claim and suggested the merchant petition Rome for compensation. When the merchant received contradictory responses from the same government, he naturally complained to Roman authorities, creating exactly the kind of diplomatic embarrassment that Egypt could least afford. Roman officials began asking pointed questions about who actually ruled Egypt and whether the kingdom was capable of honoring its agreements. Pothinus seized this moment to act. In a carefully orchestrated palace coup, he convinced the royal guard that Cleopatra's independent actions were endangering Egypt's relationship with Rome and threatening the kingdom's survival. The army, faced with choosing between an 18-year-old woman who wanted to fight Rome and a 10-year-old boy who promised to obey it, made the pragmatic choice. Cleopatra woke one morning to find palace guards at her door, not to protect her, but to escort her to temporary quarters while the royal council addressed concerns about governmental coordination. It was a polite way of saying she was under house arrest, while her brother's advisors decided what to do with her. The solution they chose was elegant in its simplicity. Cleopatra would be given a generous allowance and comfortable accommodations in a palace outside Alexandria, where she could pursue her scholarly interests without interfering in governmental affairs. Ptolemy XIII would rule as sole pharaoh, guided by experienced advisors who understood Egypt's delicate position. Everyone would be happy, and most importantly, everyone would be alive. Cleopatra, demonstrating the political instincts that would define her entire career, smiled graciously, accepted their terms, and began planning her escape before the guards had finished explaining her new living arrangements. Her flight from Egypt was a masterpiece of preparation disguised as panic. Rather than fleeing randomly, she headed directly for Syria, where her father had once found refuge, and where she had carefully cultivated relationships with merchants, soldiers, and tribal leaders who remembered Ptolemy XII's generous payments for past services. The months Cleopatra spent in Syrian exile were perhaps the most crucial of her entire education in real politics. Stripped of royal luxury and surrounded by hardened mercenaries and pragmatic tribal chiefs, she learned lessons that no palace tutor could have taught her. She discovered how to inspire loyalty in men who followed strength rather than bloodline. She mastered the art of promising future rewards to secure present support. Most importantly, she learned that survival sometimes required betting everything on a single, desperate gamble. While she gathered her forces, events in Alexandria revealed the weaknesses of her brother's regime. Ptolemy XIII, guided by advisors who prioritized stability over effectiveness, proved incapable of addressing Egypt's mounting problems. The grain shortage worsened, tax collection faltered, and Roman officials began expressing doubts about the boy king's competence. More dangerously, their sister Arsinoe IV had used Cleopatra's exile to position herself as an alternative to both siblings. She quietly gathered support among court factions, who wanted neither a woman who defied Rome nor a child who couldn't make decisions without consulting his advisors every few minutes. By late 48 BCE, Egypt had effectively three rulers: Ptolemy XIII in Alexandria, trying to govern through a council that agreed on little except their dislike of his sisters; Cleopatra in Syria, assembling an army of mercenaries and tribal allies; and Arsinoe IV in the palace, smiling sweetly while sharpening her political knives. The stage was set for a three-way civil war that would determine not just who ruled Egypt, but whether there would be an Egypt left to rule. The kingdom that had survived Alexander's death, Roman expansion, and 3 centuries of Ptolemaic family feuds was about to face its greatest test yet, a conflict that would end with foreign soldiers occupying Alexandria and one of history's most famous rulers hiding in a carpet. But before that famous carpet scene could unfold, Egypt's civil war would take an unexpected turn. A Roman general named Julius Caesar, chasing his own enemies across the Mediterranean, was about to stumble into Egyptian politics and discover that choosing sides in a Ptolemaic family feud was far more complicated than conquering Gaul. The dying kingdom was about to meet the dying republic, and neither would ever be the same. In October of 48 BCE, as Cleopatra was still gathering mercenaries in the Syrian desert, and Ptolemy XIII was struggling to maintain order in Alexandria, the Mediterranean world was turned upside down by a single battle. At Phaselis in Greece, Julius Caesar had decisively defeated Pompey the Great, ending their civil war and making Caesar the undisputed master of Rome. But Pompey had escaped the battlefield, and Caesar, never one to leave loose ends untied, was in hot pursuit. Pompey's flight would bring him to Egypt, a decision that seemed logical at the time, but would prove catastrophic for everyone involved. Egypt had supported him during the civil war, sending money and ships to his cause. Surely the Ptolemies would offer sanctuary to their former ally, giving him time to regroup and perhaps mount a comeback against Caesar. What Pompey failed to consider was that the Ptolemies had 3 centuries of experience in reading political winds, and those winds were now blowing entirely in Caesar's favor. When his ship appeared off the coast of Alexandria, young Ptolemy XIII's advisors faced an impossible choice: honor their alliance with Pompey and risk Caesar's wrath, or betray their former ally to curry favor with the victor. They chose a third option that managed to be both morally reprehensible and strategically disastrous. Rather than offering Pompey sanctuary or honestly refusing him entry, they invited him ashore and murdered him as he stepped off his boat, presenting his severed head to Caesar as a gift when the Roman general arrived 3 days later. Caesar's reaction was not what they had expected. Rather than gratitude for eliminating his enemy, Caesar reportedly wept at the sight of Pompey's head and had the assassins executed. Whether this was genuine grief for a former ally or calculated political theater is debatable, but the message was clear: Caesar would decide his enemies' fates himself, and he had no respect for those who murdered their guests. More importantly for Egypt's future, Caesar's arrival in Alexandria was supposed to be a brief stop to settle the Pompey matter before returning to Rome. Instead, he found himself in the middle of a civil war between siblings, with a nearly empty treasury, restless population, and a kingdom that owed Rome enormous sums of money. Rather than leaving immediately, Caesar decided to stay and sort out Egypt's affairs personally. This decision would change the course of world history, though no one realized it at the time. Caesar took up residence in Alexandria's royal palace, officially as a mediator between Ptolemy XIII and Cleopatra. In reality, he was acting as Egypt's de facto ruler, while deciding which sibling would better serve Roman interests. This was an unprecedented situation. No Roman general had ever involved himself so directly in Egyptian internal affairs, and certainly none had taken up residence in the pharaoh's own palace. Meanwhile, Cleopatra was still in exile, commanding a modest army, but lacking the resources to assault Alexandria directly. She needed to reach Caesar before her brother's advisors could convince the Roman general that supporting the boy king was Rome's safest option. The problem was that Alexandria was heavily guarded, and any messenger she sent could be intercepted or bought off by Pothinus. So Cleopatra chose the most direct approach possible. She would go herself. The famous carpet scene has been romanticized by centuries of storytellers, but the reality was likely more political theater than romantic gesture. According to the most reliable accounts, Cleopatra had herself smuggled into the palace, wrapped in a linen sheet or carpet, carried by a loyal servant named Apollodorus. When the bundle was unrolled in Caesar's private chambers, out stepped the exiled queen of Egypt. This wasn't the desperate gambit of a lovesick teenager. It was a calculated political masterstroke. By appearing in Caesar's private quarters unannounced, Cleopatra achieved several goals simultaneously. She demonstrated her resourcefulness and courage, proved that her brother's security was inadequate, showed that she commanded loyalty even in Alexandria, and most importantly, got Caesar's undivided attention before her rivals could influence him. Caesar, 52 years old and veteran of countless political intrigues, immediately recognized what he was dealing with. Here was a 21-year-old woman, who had just pulled off one of the most audacious political stunts he had ever witnessed, and who was now calmly discussing Egyptian affairs in perfect Latin, while her brother's guards searched the palace for imaginary assassins. What followed was one of history's most consequential seductions, though calling it seduction misses the point entirely. Cleopatra didn't win Caesar through physical beauty or exotic sensuality. She won him through intelligence, wit, and political acumen that matched his own. Here was someone who could discuss military strategy, debate philosophy, calculate tax revenues, and negotiate treaties with equal facility. For a man accustomed to being the smartest person in any room, finding an intellectual equal was probably more intoxicating than any physical attraction. Their alliance was sealed within days, but it immediately triggered the very civil war that Caesar had supposedly come to prevent. Ptolemy XIII's advisors, realizing that Cleopatra had outmaneuvered them, declared war on both Caesar and their former queen. They controlled the Egyptian army, most of Alexandria's population, and had the support of Arsinoe IV, who saw opportunity in the chaos. What began as a family dispute became the Alexandrian War, a brutal urban conflict that trapped Caesar and Cleopatra in the royal palace, while Ptolemy XIII's forces controlled the rest of the city. For months, Caesar found himself in the unprecedented position of being besieged in a foreign capital, dependent on naval reinforcements and Cleopatra's knowledge of Alexandria's hidden passages and secret tunnels. The war revealed both Caesar's military genius and Cleopatra's political cunning. Caesar turned the palace quarter into an impregnable fortress, using Alexandria's own architecture against its defenders. Cleopatra provided intelligence about the city's defenses, identified potential allies among the population, and helped negotiate with tribal leaders who might support their cause. The conflict's turning point came when reinforcements finally arrived from Rome and Asia Minor. Ptolemy XIII's army, despite its initial advantages, proved no match for Caesar's veterans once they had room to maneuver. The young pharaoh died in the final battle. Some sources say he drowned while fleeing. Others suggest he was killed by his own men who were seeking Caesar's mercy. Arsinoe IV, who had briefly declared herself pharaoh during the chaos, was captured and would later be paraded through Rome in Caesar's triumph before being executed. The Ptolemaic family's talent for eliminating each other had finally met its match in Roman efficiency. With her siblings dead or defeated, Cleopatra found herself sole ruler of Egypt for the first time in her life, but her victory came at an enormous cost. Alexandria had been damaged by months of fighting. The royal treasury was depleted, and Egypt was now clearly a Roman protectorate rather than an independent kingdom. Yet Cleopatra had gained something that no Ptolemaic ruler had possessed in generations: the backing of Rome's most powerful man. Caesar's support wasn't just military, it was personal, political, and soon to become dynastic. In 47 BCE, roughly 9 months after their first meeting, Cleopatra gave birth to a son she named Ptolemy XV. Though history knows him as Caesarion, Little Caesar, the timing left little doubt about the child's paternity, though Caesar never officially acknowledged him. For Cleopatra, Caesarion represented the ultimate fusion of Egyptian and Roman power, a pharaoh with Caesar's blood, who could potentially rule both Egypt and Rome. Caesar's extended stay in Egypt raised eyebrows throughout the Roman world. The man who had conquered Gaul in 8 years was spending the better part of a year in Alexandria, apparently more interested in Egyptian affairs than Roman ones. His enemies in Rome began spreading rumors about Caesar being bewitched by an exotic queen, while his allies worried that his Egyptian dalliance was undermining his political position. But Caesar wasn't just enjoying royal luxury, he was conducting a comprehensive study of Egyptian administration, agriculture, and culture. The famous Nile voyage he took with Cleopatra wasn't a romantic cruise, but a fact-finding mission that took them from Alexandria to the First Cataract, allowing Caesar to inspect Egypt's agricultural resources, military defenses, and administrative systems firsthand. The voyage also served as political theater, displaying their alliance to Egyptian subjects who needed to understand that their queen now ruled with Roman backing. Local officials, priests, and merchants who met the royal barge saw Caesar and Cleopatra dining as equals, conducting business together, and presenting themselves as partners rather than conqueror and conquered. For Cleopatra, this period represented everything she had been educated to achieve. She was ruling Egypt as sole pharaoh, backed by Rome's greatest general, mother to a son who carried both Egyptian and Roman royal blood. She had outmaneuvered her siblings, survived civil war, and secured her kingdom's independence through the most powerful alliance possible. But she had also learned that Roman protection came with Roman expectations. Caesar expected Egypt to honor its financial obligations, provide grain for Roman markets, and support Roman foreign policy. The independence she had fought for was real but limited. She could rule Egypt as she saw fit, as long as her decisions served Roman interests. When Caesar finally departed for Rome in late 47 BCE, he left behind a transformed Egypt. Cleopatra was undisputed ruler, but she ruled a kingdom that was now clearly within Rome's sphere of influence. She had gained power by allying with Caesar, but that alliance made her dependent on his continued success and goodwill. Most importantly, she had tasted what real power felt like when backed by Rome's military might. The question that would define the rest of her reign was whether she could maintain that power if Roman support ever wavered, and whether her son Caesarion might someday claim the inheritance that Caesar had never officially acknowledged. The gods had met mortals in Alexandria, and both had been changed by the encounter. But the real test of their alliance was yet to come, when Caesar would summon Cleopatra to Rome itself, and she would discover whether an Egyptian queen could survive in the heart of the Roman political machine. With Caesar's departure in late 47 BCE, 23-year-old Cleopatra finally found herself in the position she had been educated for her entire life. Sole ruler of Egypt, backed by Rome's most powerful man, with no siblings left to challenge her authority. For the first time since ascending the throne, she could govern Egypt according to her own vision, rather than constantly looking over her shoulder for palace conspiracies or Roman interference. The consolidation of power after the Alexandrian War revealed Cleopatra's remarkable administrative abilities. While most rulers might have focused on punishing their enemies and rewarding their supporters, Cleopatra took a more pragmatic approach that would have impressed Machiavelli. She systematically identified everyone who had supported her brother, not to execute them, but to understand why they had opposed her and how their concerns could be addressed. Many of Ptolemy XIII's supporters had backed him, not from personal loyalty, but from genuine fear that a female ruler who defied Roman wishes would bring disaster to Egypt. Cleopatra's solution was elegantly simple. She would prove that a strong Egypt served Roman interests better than a weak one, and that her independence from Rome was actually valuable to Rome. Her first major reform tackled Egypt's economic crisis head-on. The kingdom's finances had been devastated by years of poor harvests, Roman tribute payments, and civil war expenses. Rather than simply raising taxes, the traditional Ptolemaic solution to financial problems, Cleopatra implemented a comprehensive economic recovery program that demonstrated her mathematical training and political intelligence. She renegotiated tribute payments with Rome, arguing that a prosperous Egypt could pay more in the long term than a bankrupt one could pay immediately. She restructured internal taxation to encourage agricultural production and trade, rather than simply extracting maximum revenue. Most importantly, she used Egypt's strategic position to expand trade relationships with Arabia, Ethiopia, and India, reducing the kingdom's dependence on Roman markets. These policies worked so well that within 2 years, Egypt's treasury had recovered enough to fund major public works projects while maintaining regular tribute payments to Rome. It was exactly the kind of fiscal miracle that made Roman senators wonder why their own finances were always in chaos, while this foreign queen seemed capable of balancing budgets effortlessly. But Cleopatra understood that economic success meant nothing without religious legitimacy. And here she broke decisively with 3 centuries of Ptolemaic tradition, where her ancestors had remained Greek pharaohs ruling over Egyptian subjects. Cleopatra presented herself as the divine embodiment of Isis, the greatest goddess in the Egyptian pantheon. This wasn't mere political theater. It was a fundamental reimagining of what it meant to be pharaoh. Cleopatra learned Egyptian religious ceremonies, participated in traditional festivals, and spoke to her subjects in their own language during religious observances. She commissioned temple renovations throughout Egypt, restored ancient ceremonies that had been neglected under previous rulers, and presented herself as the living goddess who protected Egypt from foreign enemies. The transformation was remarkable. For the first time in 3 centuries, ordinary Egyptians saw their pharaoh as truly Egyptian rather than as a foreign occupier. Cleopatra's religious persona gave her a connection to her subjects that no previous Ptolemaic ruler had possessed, creating loyalty that went far deeper than mere political allegiance. Her relationship with Alexandria's Greek population was more complex. The educated Greek elite who had supported her father appreciated Cleopatra's intelligence and cultural sophistication, but they were nervous about her Egyptian religious activities and her obvious affection for native Egyptian culture. These were people who prided themselves on their Hellenic heritage and saw Egypt primarily as the setting for their cosmopolitan lifestyle. Cleopatra's solution was to be simultaneously Egyptian pharaoh and Greek intellectual, switching roles as circumstances required. In Memphis, she was Isis incarnate, blessing the harvest and communing with ancient gods. In Alexandria, she was the philosophical queen, debating with scholars and patronizing artistic endeavors. It was an exhausting performance, but it allowed her to unite Egypt's diverse populations under her rule. Her cultural patronage during this period was legendary. The Great Library of Alexandria, though diminished from its peak, still attracted scholars from across the Mediterranean. Cleopatra not only funded their research but participated in it, contributing to mathematical treatises and philosophical debates. She commissioned new works on astronomy, medicine, and engineering, ensuring that Alexandria remained the intellectual capital of the ancient world. More controversially, she also funded research into practical applications of knowledge. Egyptian engineers developed new siege engines, improved irrigation systems, and created better naval designs. Cleopatra understood that cultural prestige meant nothing without military and economic power to back it up, and she was determined that Egypt would never again be as vulnerable as it had been during her brother's reign. Her military campaigns during this period were limited but effective. Rather than attempting major conquests that might alarm Rome, Cleopatra focused on securing Egypt's traditional boundaries and suppressing rebellions in Upper Egypt and Nubia. These campaigns served multiple purposes. They provided military experience for her army, demonstrated her strength to potential enemies, and reminded everyone that Egypt was still capable of independent military action. The most significant military achievement was the pacification of the Thebaid, Egypt's southern region, where local governors had declared independence during the civil war. Cleopatra's campaign was swift and decisive, but she followed victory with reconciliation, incorporating Theban leaders into her administration and funding major temple renovations in the region. It was conquest followed by integration, a model she would later apply to larger ambitions. Throughout this period, Cleopatra maintained her complex relationship with Rome through careful diplomacy and regular communication with Caesar. She sent tribute payments punctually, provided grain for Roman markets, and offered intelligence about Eastern Mediterranean affairs. But she also quietly expanded Egypt's independent diplomatic relationships, establishing trade agreements and military alliances that didn't require Roman approval. It was a delicate balance, appearing completely loyal to Rome while gradually reducing Egypt's dependence on Roman goodwill. Cleopatra was essentially buying time and building strength for the day when Roman protection might no longer be available, or when Egyptian interests might conflict with Roman demands. The test of this strategy came in 46 BCE, when Caesar invited Cleopatra to visit Rome. The invitation was simultaneously an honor and a summons. Caesar wanted to display his exotic ally to Roman society, but he also wanted her where he could monitor her activities and ensure her continued loyalty. Cleopatra's arrival in Rome caused the sensation Caesar had probably intended, though not necessarily the kind he had expected. She traveled with a magnificent entourage that included scholars, artists, musicians, and enough treasure to remind everyone that Egypt remained fabulously wealthy. Her procession through Rome was a carefully choreographed display of Egyptian grandeur, designed to impress Romans who thought they had seen everything. Caesar installed her in his villa across the Tiber, officially as a guest of the Roman people, but practically as part of his household. This arrangement caused immediate scandal, not because Romans were shocked by powerful men keeping foreign mistresses, but because Caesar was treating Cleopatra as an equal rather than a conquered trophy. She dined with Roman senators, debated with Roman philosophers, and conducted diplomatic business from Caesar's own residence. Most shocking of all, she brought young Caesarion with her, And while Caesar never publicly acknowledged the child, he didn't deny the obvious family resemblance either. Roman society didn't know what to make of Cleopatra. She was undeniably intelligent, cultured, and wealthy, but she was also foreign, female, and far too independent for traditional Roman sensibilities. Conservative senators muttered about Caesar being corrupted by Eastern luxury, while their wives were simultaneously fascinated and threatened by this foreign queen, who seemed to fear no one. Cleopatra, meanwhile, was conducting her own intelligence operation. She studied Roman politics with the same intensity she had once applied to mathematics, identifying key players, understanding factional alignments, and learning how Roman power actually functioned behind the constitutional facade. What she discovered was both encouraging and terrifying. Rome was incredibly powerful, but also incredibly unstable. The Republic's institutions were breaking down under the strain of governing a vast empire, and Roman politics had devolved into a series of personal rivalries between ambitious generals. Caesar's position, while dominant, depended entirely on his personal abilities and political alliances. Most importantly, she learned that Rome had no clear succession mechanism. When Caesar died, and Cleopatra was intelligent enough to realize that all Roman strongmen eventually died violently, there would be another civil war. The question was whether Egypt would be strong enough to survive the chaos, and whether her son Caesarion might have a role to play in Rome's future. Her stay in Rome lasted nearly 2 years, during which she witnessed Caesar at the height of his power. She saw him triumph over his enemies, reform Roman institutions, and plan campaigns that would extend Roman rule to Britain and Parthia. But she also saw the growing resentment among senators who chafed under one-man rule, and the increasing isolation of a leader who had outgrown the system that created him. Living in Caesar's villa, Cleopatra had a front-row seat to the political maneuvering that would ultimately destroy him. She watched senators who smiled at Caesar's dinner parties plot against him in private. She observed the growing tension between Caesar's ambitions and Roman traditions. Most crucially, she began to understand that Caesar's greatest strength, his refusal to compromise with his enemies, was also his fatal weakness. By early 44 BCE, Cleopatra had learned everything she needed to know about Roman power. It was vast but fragile, built on personal relationships rather than institutional stability. The man who protected Egypt could be removed by a handful of conspirators with daggers, and when that happened, Egypt would need to be ready to protect itself. What she couldn't have predicted was how quickly that lesson would become relevant, or how Caesar's assassination would transform her from Rome's protected ally into a player in the most dangerous political game in the ancient world. The Golden Age was about to end, and Cleopatra would discover whether 3 years of careful preparation had made Egypt strong enough to survive what was coming. On the morning of March 15, 44 BCE, Cleopatra woke in Caesar's villa to what seemed like an ordinary day in Roman politics. Caesar had a Senate meeting scheduled. There were the usual rumors of various conspiracies, a common occurrence in Rome, and she was planning to meet with several Roman merchants to discuss expanding Egyptian trade routes. By sunset, the ancient world had changed forever, and Cleopatra found herself in more danger than she had faced since fleeing Alexandria 6 years earlier. The assassination of Julius Caesar was swift, brutal, and thorough. 23 senators surrounded him in the theater of Pompeii, and 23 daggers ended the life of Rome's most powerful man. The conspirators, led by Marcus Brutus and Gaius Cassius, believed they were saving the Roman Republic from tyranny. What they actually accomplished was unleashing chaos that would consume the Mediterranean world for the next 13 years. For Cleopatra, the news arrived through a breathless messenger who had run directly from the Senate house to Caesar's villa. The Queen of Egypt, who had spent 2 years studying Roman politics, immediately understood that Caesar's death meant far more than the loss of a protector. It meant the complete collapse of the political arrangements that had kept Egypt safe and independent. Her first instinct was entirely correct. Get out of Rome immediately, before anyone decided that Caesar's foreign mistress might make a convenient scapegoat for the Republic's problems. Within hours of receiving the news, Cleopatra was packing her household, arranging transportation, and preparing for a hasty departure that needed to look dignified rather than panicked. She couldn't simply flee like a common criminal. She was still officially a guest of the Roman people, and an allied queen. But she also couldn't stay in Rome, where senators who had just murdered Caesar might decide that his Egyptian ally knew too much about their plans or posed too great a threat to their vision of restored republican government. Her solution was characteristically clever. She announced that news of Caesar's death required her immediate return to Egypt to ensure stability in the kingdom and prevent any disruption to grain shipments that fed Roman citizens. This gave her departure a patriotic Roman veneer. She was leaving to serve Roman interests, not fleeing from Roman justice. The journey back to Alexandria was fraught with dangers that hadn't existed during her confident arrival 2 years earlier. Every port might harbor Caesar's enemies. Every ship captain might be looking for an opportunity to curry favor with the new regime by delivering Caesar's foreign queen in chains. Cleopatra traveled with a reduced entourage, disguised her identity when possible, and took a deliberately circuitous route that made tracking her movements nearly impossible. Most crucially, she traveled with 3-year-old Caesarion, whose very existence was now a political liability. The child bore an unmistakable resemblance to his father, and in the hands of Caesar's enemies, he could be used as proof of the dead dictator's megalomania and foreign corruption. In the hands of Caesar's supporters, he might represent a rallying point for revenge, but that would make him a target for assassination. Cleopatra's return to Alexandria in late 44 BCE marked the beginning of the most precarious period of her reign. For the first time since the Alexandrian War, she ruled Egypt without Roman protection, and the Mediterranean political situation was changing so rapidly that yesterday's ally could become tomorrow's mortal enemy without warning. The immediate challenge was internal stability. Egypt's prosperity had been built on the assumption of continued Roman protection and preferential treatment. With Caesar dead and Roman politics in chaos, Egypt faced the prospect of hostile Roman commanders seizing power and treating the kingdom as conquered territory rather than allied nation. Cleopatra's advisors urged her to immediately pledge allegiance to the Senate and the self-proclaimed liberators who had killed Caesar. This was the safe choice, supporting the traditional republican government against the chaos of civil war. But Cleopatra, who had spent 2 years observing Roman politics firsthand, understood that the assassins had won a battle, not a war. Caesar's death had created a power vacuum that would inevitably be filled by his supporters seeking revenge, and Cleopatra correctly predicted that the Republicans who killed him lacked both the military strength and political skill to maintain control. The question was which of Caesar's heirs would emerge victorious from the coming civil war, and how Egypt could position itself to survive regardless of the outcome. The situation became clearer when news arrived of the Second Triumvirate's formation in 43 BCE. Mark Antony, Caesar's loyal lieutenant, Octavian, Caesar's great-nephew and adopted heir, and Lepidus, the high priest, had divided the Roman world among themselves and declared their intention to avenge Caesar's murder. This was both good news and bad news for Cleopatra. Good because it meant Caesar's killers would be defeated. Bad because it meant 3 Roman strongmen now controlled different parts of the empire, and Egypt would eventually have to choose sides. Cleopatra's response demonstrated the diplomatic skills that had kept her alive through 6 years of Roman civil wars. Rather than immediately declaring support for any particular triumvir, she maintained official neutrality while quietly gathering intelligence about each man's character, capabilities, and likely survival prospects. Her intelligence network, built during the golden years after Caesar's departure, now proved invaluable. Egyptian merchants trading throughout the Mediterranean reported on military movements, political developments, and the shifting loyalties of Roman commanders. Temple priests maintained correspondence with colleagues in other cities, providing information about local reactions to the triumvirate's policies. Most importantly, Cleopatra's personal agents in Rome, Alexandria, and other major cities created a communication system that often provided more accurate information than official diplomatic channels. Through these networks, she learned that Octavian was young, ruthless, and completely devoted to Caesar's memory, but lacked military experience and personal charisma. Lepidus was competent, but uninspiring, clearly the junior partner in the triumvirate. Mark Antony was a brilliant general and natural leader, but also impulsive, prone to excess, and easily distracted by personal pleasures. The analysis suggested that the triumvirate would eventually fragment, probably into a conflict between Octavian and Antony, with Lepidus eliminated or marginalized. When that happened, Egypt would need to choose the winning side or risk destruction by whichever triumvirate emerged victorious. While conducting this delicate diplomatic balancing act, Cleopatra faced serious internal challenges that threatened Egypt's stability. The kingdom's economy, which had flourished under Roman protection, was now vulnerable to disruption from the civil wars. Roman grain contracts were cancelled or renegotiated under less favorable terms. Egyptian merchants found their ships searched by hostile Roman commanders looking for evidence of support for the wrong side. More seriously, Cleopatra's own legitimacy was being questioned by some Egyptian nobles who argued that her association with Caesar had compromised Egypt's independence and dignity. These critics, led by surviving members of the old Ptolemaic court, suggested that Egypt should distance itself from Roman affairs entirely and return to the isolationist policies that had allegedly preserved the kingdom's independence in earlier generations. Cleopatra's response to these internal critics was swift and decisive. In a move that shocked even her supporters, she announced the sudden death of her younger brother Ptolemy XIV, who had served as nominal co-ruler since Ptolemy XIII's death. The official cause was illness, but the timing was remarkably convenient. Ptolemy XIV's death eliminated the last potential rallying point for domestic opposition to Cleopatra's Roman policies. More controversially, she elevated 4-year-old Caesarion to the position of co-ruler, proclaiming him as Ptolemy XIV and heir to the Egyptian throne. This was an extraordinary break with tradition. Previous Ptolemaic co-rulers had been siblings or spouses, not children. But it also sent a clear political message. Egypt's future was tied to Caesar's legacy, and Caesarion represented the continuation of the alliance that had brought Egypt prosperity and security. The elevation of Caesarion to co-ruler was also a calculated gamble on the future of Roman politics. If Caesar's supporters ultimately prevailed in the civil wars, then his son, even an unofficial one, might have a role to play in the new Roman order. If they were defeated, then Caesarion's royal Egyptian blood would provide legitimacy to continued Ptolemaic rule regardless of Roman politics. Throughout 43 and 42 BCE, as the Triumvirs hunted down Caesar's assassins and consolidated their control over the Roman world, Cleopatra walked a diplomatic tightrope that would have challenged the most experienced statesman. She provided limited support to the Triumvirate, enough to avoid being labeled an enemy, not enough to be committed to their cause if they were defeated. When the Triumvirs requested Egyptian ships for their campaign against Brutus and Cassius, Cleopatra sent a small fleet that was conveniently delayed by storms and mechanical problems, arriving too late to participate in the decisive battles. When they requested Egyptian grain, she provided it at full market price rather than as tribute, establishing Egypt's status as neutral supplier rather than subordinate ally. Most importantly, she maintained diplomatic communications with all parties while committing fully to none. Egyptian ambassadors appeared in Antony's camp, Octavian's headquarters, and even in the courts of Eastern kings who were hedging their own bets about the civil war's outcome. The strategy required extraordinary nerve and perfect timing. One diplomatic miscalculation could result in Roman armies marching on Alexandria. One intercepted message could provide evidence of treachery that would justify Egypt's conquest. One change in the military situation could leave Egypt allied with the losing side and facing the winner's vengeance. But by 42 BCE, as news arrived of the Republicans' final defeat at the Battle of Philippi, Cleopatra's careful neutrality had preserved Egypt's independence and kept her options open. Brutus and Cassius were dead. The Triumvirate controlled the Roman world, and Egypt had avoided being crushed by either side in the conflict. Now came the most dangerous moment of all. The Triumvirates were dividing the Roman world among themselves, and Egypt fell within Mark Antony's sphere of influence. The man who would control the Eastern Mediterranean was known for his military brilliance, political ambitions, and legendary appetites for both warfare and pleasure. Cleopatra had kept Egypt independent through 2 years of Roman civil war, but her greatest test was yet to come. Mark Antony was summoning her to meet him in Tarsus, and the Queen of Egypt was about to discover whether her intelligence, wealth, and political skills could preserve her kingdom's freedom in a face-to-face encounter with Rome's most charismatic general. The careful diplomatic game was ending, and the stakes were about to become personal. In the summer of 41 BCE, Mark Antony was at the pinnacle of his career. He had just helped defeat Caesar's assassins at Philippi, claimed dominion over the entire eastern Mediterranean, and was now establishing himself in the opulent city of Tarsus to receive tribute from the kings and queens who owed their thrones to Roman goodwill. For a man who had risen from relative obscurity to become one of 3 rulers of the known world, it was a moment to savor his own magnificence. Antony's summons to Cleopatra was routine by Roman standards. Another Eastern monarch coming to pay homage and negotiate tribute arrangements with their new overlord. But if Antony thought he was simply collecting taxes from a client queen, he was about to receive an education in the difference between ordinary royalty and Cleopatra VII of Egypt. The summons itself was politically loaded. By ordering Cleopatra to come to him, rather than visiting Egypt himself, Antony was asserting Roman dominance and treating her as a subordinate. For most rulers, this would have been humiliating but necessary, the price of staying in Rome's good graces. Cleopatra, however, had spent the last 3 years studying Roman psychology, and she understood that the greatest weakness of powerful men was their need to be impressed. Her response to Antony's summons was a masterpiece of political theatre that turned a diplomatic disadvantage into a spectacular opportunity. Rather than arriving like a nervous supplicant seeking favor, Cleopatra staged what was essentially an invasion designed to overwhelm Antony's senses and demonstrate that Egypt remained a power worth courting rather than simply conquering. The preparations alone took months. Cleopatra assembled a fleet of ships unlike anything the Mediterranean had ever seen, vessels covered in gold and silver, with purple sails perfumed with exotic spices. Her flagship was designed to represent the floating palace of Venus, the Roman goddess of love, with Cleopatra herself dressed as the deity and surrounded by an elaborate court of attendants costumed as cupids and sea nymphs. When this spectacular flotilla appeared in the harbor at Tarsus, it created exactly the sensation Cleopatra had calculated. Crowds abandoned Antony's official reception to gawk at the Egyptian queen's arrival, leaving the Roman Triumvir sitting alone in his tribunal, while his entire audience rushed to the waterfront to witness what appeared to be a goddess materializing from mythology. The message was unmistakable. Egypt was not just another Eastern kingdom seeking Roman protection, but a civilization so wealthy and sophisticated that it could afford to stage mythological spectacles as casual diplomatic gestures. More personally, Cleopatra was not just another client queen, but a woman who commanded resources and imagination that could make even Roman triumphs pale by comparison. Antony, who prided himself on recognizing political theater when he saw it, was simultaneously impressed and challenged. Here was someone playing the game at his own level, and playing it with resources that even Rome might envy. His response was equally calculated. Rather than being offended by Cleopatra's upstaging of his reception, he publicly praised her magnificent arrival and invited her to dine with him. Cleopatra's counter-invitation was the diplomatic equivalent of raising the stakes in a poker game. She would be delighted to dine with the great Mark Antony aboard her own ship as her guest, where he could properly appreciate Egyptian hospitality. It was a polite way of saying that if he wanted to negotiate with Egypt, he would do so on her terms, in her space, surrounded by her magnificence. The dinner that followed became legendary throughout the ancient world, though separating fact from embellishment is nearly impossible after 2,000 years of retelling. What seems certain is that Cleopatra staged an evening of luxury that was designed to demonstrate Egypt's wealth while seducing Antony both politically and personally. The banquet reportedly featured delicacies from across the known world, entertainment by the finest musicians and dancers money could hire, and decorations that represented the accumulated treasure of centuries of Ptolemaic rule. Cleopatra herself appeared in costume as Isis, the Egyptian goddess she claimed to embody, while Antony was invited to play the role of Dionysus, the Greek god of wine and revelry, with whom he identified. But beneath the pageantry was serious political negotiation. Cleopatra was not just seducing Antony, she was demonstrating that an alliance with Egypt offered advantages that simple conquest could never provide. Egypt's wealth could fund his ambitions, Egypt's strategic position could secure his eastern frontier, and Egypt's queen could provide political legitimacy that would strengthen his position against his rivals in Rome. Mark Antony was 41 years old, a veteran of countless military campaigns and political intrigues, and nobody's fool when it came to recognizing calculated seduction. But he was also a man whose appetites for pleasure, glory, and power had always exceeded his capacity for self-control. Cleopatra offered all three in unprecedented quantities, wrapped in intelligence that matched his own, and presented by a woman who clearly feared neither Rome nor Romans. Their relationship, which began as mutual political calculation, quickly developed into something more complex and dangerous. Antony was unlike Caesar in crucial ways. Where Caesar had been controlled and calculating, Antony was passionate and impulsive. Where Caesar had treated Cleopatra as a useful ally, Antony seemed genuinely captivated by her combination of intelligence, ambition, and exotic appeal. The winter they spent together in Alexandria sealed both their personal alliance and Egypt's political future. Antony abandoned his planned military campaigns to remain in Egypt, officially to settle Eastern affairs, but practically to enjoy the most luxurious lifestyle available anywhere in the ancient world. Alexandria offered everything Rome could provide, plus the intellectual sophistication, cultural refinement, and sheer opulence that the Egyptian capital had perfected over 3 centuries. For Cleopatra, Antony's extended stay represented both triumph and risk. She had successfully seduced Rome's eastern commander and secured Egypt's immediate independence, but she had also tied her kingdom's fate to a man whose impulsiveness could prove as dangerous as his power was useful. Their relationship produced immediate political consequences and personal complications. In 40 BCE, Cleopatra gave birth to twins, Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, named for the sun and moon in a symbolic gesture that suggested their parents' ambitions might extend beyond mere survival. The children's names also represented the fusion of Egyptian and Roman power that their parents envisioned, a new dynasty that could rule both East and West. But reality intruded on their Alexandrian idol in the form of urgent messages from Rome. The Triumvirate was fracturing, Octavian was consolidating power in the West, and Antony's absence from Roman politics was allowing his enemies to portray him as another Roman general, corrupted by Eastern luxury and foreign influence. Antony's departure from Egypt in late 40 BCE marked the beginning of a new phase in his relationship with Cleopatra, one that would test whether their alliance could survive the pressures of Roman politics and personal separation. His return to Rome was politically necessary, but personally devastating, forcing him to abandon the woman who had become his closest advisor and most important ally. The political settlement that followed was a masterstroke of cynical diplomacy that left both Antony and Cleopatra feeling betrayed. To strengthen the triumvirate and counter Octavian's growing influence, Antony agreed to marry Octavian's sister, Octavia, a political marriage designed to cement the alliance between the two most powerful men in Rome. For Cleopatra, the news of Antony's marriage was both a personal betrayal and a political disaster. The man who had promised to make Egypt his partner in reshaping the Mediterranean world had instead chosen to strengthen his position in Roman politics by abandoning their alliance for a more conventional relationship with Octavian's family. The years that followed tested Cleopatra's political skills and personal resilience as severely as any crisis she had faced. Abandoned by her Roman protector, married to his political rival's sister, and facing the prospect that her children might never be acknowledged by their father, she could have retreated into isolation or despair. Instead, she used the separation to do what she had always done best: consolidate power, strengthen Egypt, and prepare for whatever political opportunities might emerge from the inevitable collapse of Antony's marriage to Octavia. She correctly calculated that a political marriage based on convenience rather than compatibility could not possibly survive the pressures that would be placed on it by ambitious men with conflicting goals. During Antony's absence, Cleopatra implemented the most comprehensive military and economic reforms in Egypt's recent history. She expanded the royal navy, modernized the army with new equipment and training methods, and established defensive alliances with neighboring kingdoms that shared her concerns about Roman expansion. Most importantly, she diversified Egypt's economy to reduce dependence on Roman markets while building up the financial reserves that would be needed to fund future conflicts. Her diplomatic activities during this period were equally impressive. Egyptian ambassadors appeared in courts throughout the eastern Mediterranean, offering trade agreements, military alliances, and cultural exchanges that gradually built a network of relationships independent of Roman approval. Cleopatra was essentially creating an alternative power structure that could function regardless of Rome's political arrangements. The balancing act required extraordinary discipline and strategic thinking. Egypt needed to remain officially loyal to Rome while building the capacity for independence. Cleopatra needed to maintain her personal relationship with Antony while preparing for the possibility that he might never return to Egypt. Most delicately, she needed to raise their children as potential heirs to both Egyptian and Roman power, while avoiding any actions that might be seen as challenging Octavian's authority. By 37 BCE, as reports reached Alexandria that Antony's marriage to Octavia was growing increasingly strained and that his military campaigns in the east were faltering, Cleopatra had transformed Egypt into something it had never been before, a truly independent power capable of challenging Rome on equal terms. The question was whether Antony would prove worthy of the alliance she was prepared to offer him, or whether she would need to find another way to preserve Egypt's independence in a world where Roman civil war seemed inevitable. The Triumvir's Gambit had succeeded beyond her wildest expectations, but the real test was yet to come, when Antony would be forced to choose between his Roman ambitions and his Egyptian alliance, with the fate of both their kingdoms hanging in the balance. By 37 BCE, Mark Antony's carefully constructed political marriage to Octavia had achieved everything except its primary purpose. The union had temporarily stabilized the Triumvirate, provided useful diplomatic cover for his eastern activities, and even produced 2 daughters who cemented his alliance with Octavian's family. What it had not done was make Antony forget the brilliant Egyptian queen who had offered him partnership in reshaping the ancient world. The pretext for Antony's return to the east was military necessity. The Parthian Empire threatened Rome's eastern frontier, and only a major campaign could secure the region for Roman rule. But anyone familiar with Antony's character understood that the prospect of reuniting with Cleopatra was at least as compelling as the promise of military glory against Rome's most dangerous enemies. Their reunion in Antioch was both a personal reconciliation and a political revolution. Antony had spent 3 years in Rome remembering why he preferred Alexandria's intellectual sophistication to Roman political brutality. Cleopatra had spent the same years transforming Egypt into a power capable of challenging Rome itself. When they met again, both were ready to pursue ambitions that neither could achieve alone. The renewed alliance was immediately formalized through the most scandalous diplomatic agreement in Roman history. Antony not only acknowledged his paternity of Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, but officially married Cleopatra according to Egyptian law, despite still being married to Octavia under Roman law. For Romans, this was either bigamy or treason, depending on whether you considered Egyptian marriage ceremonies legally valid. More provocatively, Antony began redistributing eastern territories to Cleopatra and their children, as if he were creating a new Ptolemaic empire that would stretch from Egypt to Armenia. Cyprus, which had been under direct Roman administration, was granted to Cleopatra. Parts of Syria, Cilicia, and Phoenicia were added to her kingdom. The children received territorial grants that existed mostly on paper, but suggested extraordinary ambitions for their future roles. These territorial arrangements culminated in 34 BCE with the donations of Alexandria, a public ceremony that was either the most magnificent diplomatic spectacle in ancient history or an act of treason so blatant that it made civil war inevitable. Probably both. The ceremony was staged in Alexandria's gymnasium, with Antony and Cleopatra seated on golden thrones surrounded by their children, and an audience that included diplomats from across the eastern Mediterranean. What followed was essentially the public dissolution of Roman authority in the east, and its replacement by a new dynasty that claimed to inherit both Caesar's Roman legacy and Alexander's Macedonian empire. Cleopatra was proclaimed Queen of Kings and Queen of Egypt, Cyprus, Libya, and Syria, titles that hadn't been used since the height of Ptolemaic power 3 centuries earlier. More provocatively, 13-year-old Caesarion was declared Caesar's legitimate son and heir, King of Kings, and ruler of Egypt, alongside his mother. The implications were unmistakable. If Caesarion was truly Caesar's heir, then Octavian's claim to power was illegitimate, and the boy pharaoh had a better right to rule Rome than the man who currently controlled it. The twins, now 6 years old, received kingdoms that existed more in aspiration than reality. but suggested breathtaking ambitions for the future. Alexander Helios was declared king of Armenia, Media, and Parthia, territories that would need to be conquered before he could actually rule them. Cleopatra Selene became queen of Cyrenaica and Libya, while their younger brother Ptolemy Philadelphus, born in 36 BCE, was granted Syria and Cilicia. The ceremony was completed with Antony's formal adoption of the title New Dionysus to complement Cleopatra's role as New Isis, transforming their political alliance into a claim of divine authority that superseded mere Roman law. They were presenting themselves not just as rulers but as gods, with the right to remake the Mediterranean world according to their vision. For anyone who understood Roman politics, the donations of Alexandria were a declaration of war disguised as a diplomatic ceremony. Antony was publicly rejecting Roman authority, establishing an independent Eastern Empire, and claiming that his children had rights that superseded those of Octavian himself. The only question was how quickly Octavian would respond to this unprecedented challenge. The answer came in the form of a propaganda campaign that would make modern political spin seem subtle by comparison. Octavian, who had spent years presenting himself as Caesar's legitimate heir and Rome's defender against foreign threats, suddenly had the perfect enemy, a Roman general who had abandoned his Roman wife for an Egyptian queen and was now claiming divine authority to rule the Eastern Mediterranean. Octavian's propaganda portrayed Antony not as a political rival, but as a traitor who had been corrupted by foreign luxury and exotic sensuality. Roman citizens were told that their former hero had abandoned Roman values, adopted Egyptian religious practices, and planned to move the capital of the empire from Rome to Alexandria. Most damaging of all, they were told that Antony intended to make his foreign mistress the ruler of Rome itself. The campaign against Cleopatra was even more vicious and more effective. Roman propaganda transformed the brilliant queen who had impressed Caesar and seduced Antony into a monstrous foreign witch who used supernatural powers and sexual corruption to destroy noble Roman men. She was portrayed as the enemy of everything Roman, their religion, their values, their very civilization. The irony was that much of Octavian's propaganda was based on accurate reporting of what Antony and Cleopatra were actually doing. They had established an independent Eastern Empire. They did claim divine authority, and they were challenging Rome's dominance over the Mediterranean world. The propaganda simply presented these facts in the most threatening possible terms to a Roman audience, already nervous about foreign influence and Eastern luxury. Meanwhile, the Second Triumvirate was collapsing with the mathematical precision that Cleopatra had predicted years earlier. Lepidus had been eliminated from power in 36 BCE, leaving only Antony and Octavian to divide the Roman world between them. Their alliance, already strained by personal animosity and conflicting ambitions, could not survive Antony's public rejection of Roman authority and his establishment of an independent Eastern Empire. The breakdown accelerated when Antony formally divorced Octavia in 32 BCE, officially ending his political marriage and making his conflict with Octavian irreversibly personal. Octavian responded by reading Antony's will to the Roman Senate, a document that confirmed Rome's worst fears about Antony's intentions, including his desire to be buried in Alexandria rather than Rome, and his recognition of Caesarion as Caesar's legitimate heir. By late 32 BCE, both sides were mobilizing for a war that would determine not just who ruled Rome, but whether the Roman Republic would survive or be replaced by a new kind of empire that fused Eastern and Western traditions under divine authority. Cleopatra threw Egypt's entire resources behind the coming conflict, with an enthusiasm that suggested she understood this was her last chance to achieve the vision she had pursued her entire adult life. Egypt's wealth, accumulated over centuries and carefully husbanded during her reign, was now deployed to create the largest military force the Mediterranean had ever seen. The Egyptian navy was expanded and modernized, with new ships designed specifically for the kind of large-scale naval warfare that would be necessary to defeat Octavian's forces. The army was reinforced with mercenaries from across the known world, creating a multinational force that reflected the cosmopolitan empire Antony and Cleopatra envisioned. Most importantly, Egypt's diplomatic networks were activated to secure alliances with Eastern kingdoms that shared concerns about Roman expansion. The preparations revealed the full scope of Cleopatra's long-term planning. The economic reforms she had implemented during Antony's absence had created financial reserves adequate to fund a major war. The military modernization programs had produced forces capable of challenging Roman legions on equal terms. The diplomatic initiatives had built a coalition of allies who were ready to support Egypt against Roman domination. But perhaps most importantly, Cleopatra had spent decades preparing psychologically for this moment. She had studied Roman politics, understood Roman weaknesses, and identified the internal contradictions that made the Roman system vulnerable to a sufficiently determined challenge. She knew that Roman power was based on the loyalty of generals who could be bought, citizens who could be influenced by propaganda, and allies who remained loyal only as long as Rome appeared invincible. As 32 BCE drew to a close, the ancient world prepared for a conflict that would determine its future for centuries to come. On one side stood Octavian, representing traditional Roman values, republican institutions, and Western civilization. On the other stood Antony and Cleopatra, representing a new kind of empire that would fuse Eastern wisdom with Roman power under the authority of rulers who claimed divine legitimacy. The stage was set for the most consequential naval battle in ancient history, though neither side yet realized that the fate of both the Roman Republic and Ptolemaic Egypt would be decided in the waters off a small Greek town called Actium. The Eastern Queen had committed everything to her vision of a new world order, and she was about to discover whether 3 decades of preparation had been sufficient to challenge the most powerful military machine in human history. As 32 BCE opened with both sides preparing for inevitable war, the conflict that would determine the fate of the ancient world had already been fought and won in the realm of public opinion. Octavian's propaganda machine had transformed what should have been a civil war between rival Roman commanders into a civilizational struggle between East and West, with Cleopatra cast as the exotic enemy of everything Romans held sacred. The propaganda war was perhaps the most sophisticated information campaign in ancient history, and it revealed Octavian's genius for understanding what Romans feared most deeply. Rather than attacking Antony directly, which might have generated sympathy for a fellow Roman, Octavian portrayed him as the victim of foreign corruption, a noble Roman hero who had been enslaved by an Egyptian sorceress who planned to rule Rome from Alexandria. Cleopatra became the perfect enemy for Roman anxieties. She was foreign, female, wealthy, and intelligent, everything that threatened traditional Roman masculine values. Octavian's propagandists claimed she bathed in ass's milk while Roman citizens struggled with poverty, that she worshipped animal-headed gods while Romans honored their ancestors, and that she planned to make Roman senators bow before her throne like Eastern slaves. Most effectively, the propaganda tapped into Roman fears about the reversal of natural order. Romans believed they were destined to rule the world because of their superior virtues and divine favor. The idea that an Eastern queen might rule over Romans violated every assumption about how the universe was supposed to function. Octavian presented the coming war not as a political conflict, but as a battle to preserve Roman civilization itself. The irony was that Cleopatra understood Roman psychology better than most Romans, having spent years studying their political system from the inside. She knew that Octavian's propaganda was both unfair and politically brilliant, transforming her greatest strengths, intelligence, independence, and ambition, into evidence of foreign corruption and supernatural evil. But by 32 BCE, the time for propaganda battles was ending, and the real test would be decided by the size of armies and the skill of generals. Both sides began mobilizing resources on a scale that dwarfed previous conflicts, preparing for a war that would require everything they could muster. Antony and Cleopatra's military preparations were staggering in scope and ambition. They assembled what was arguably the largest naval force in ancient history, over 500 warships ranging from massive Egyptian galleys to swift Roman Liburnians, crewed by sailors from across the eastern Mediterranean and equipped with the most advanced naval technology available. The fleet represented more than just military power. It was a floating display of the multicultural empire that Antony and Cleopatra envisioned. Egyptian captains commanded ships built in Phoenician yards, with crews speaking a dozen different languages, while Roman deserters served alongside Celtic mercenaries and Arabian marines. It was exactly the kind of cosmopolitan force that terrified Romans, who believed their strength came from unity and discipline. Their land forces were equally impressive. Over 100,000 infantry and 12,000 cavalry drawn from every corner of the eastern Mediterranean. Professional Roman legions served alongside Egyptian phalanxes, Armenian heavy cavalry, and Germanic warriors who had been recruited with promises of land and citizenship in the new empire. The army was a testament to Egypt's wealth and Antony's reputation, but it also represented the challenge of commanding forces with no common language, traditions, or loyalties beyond payment. Cleopatra's personal contribution to the war effort was extraordinary. Egypt's treasury, carefully accumulated during 2 decades of her reign, funded not just the Egyptian forces, but much of Antony's Roman contingent as well. Her ships carried not only Egyptian grain and gold, but also the siege engines, medical supplies, and logistical support that would be necessary for a prolonged campaign. More importantly, she brought strategic thinking that complemented Antony's tactical brilliance. While Antony focused on military preparations, Cleopatra worked to secure the political foundations that would be necessary for victory. She negotiated alliances with eastern kingdoms, arranged for supply lines that could support their forces indefinitely, and prepared contingency plans for multiple possible outcomes. The strategic situation favored their cause in several important ways. Control of the eastern Mediterranean would allow them to strangle Roman trade routes and threaten Italy itself. Their combined resources far exceeded anything Octavian could assemble. Most importantly, time was on their side. The longer the war lasted, the more likely it became that Octavian's support in Rome would collapse under the financial strain of maintaining large armies indefinitely. But as the campaign began, cracks appeared in their coalition that would prove fatal to their cause. The first problem was defections. Roman commanders who had initially supported Antony began switching sides as Octavian's propaganda convinced them that their loyalty to Rome required abandoning their allegiance to a man who had become a foreign queen's puppet. Each defection was both a military loss and a propaganda victory for Octavian. When experienced Roman generals like Domitius Ahenobarbus and Munatius Plancus abandoned Antony for Octavian, they brought not only their troops and knowledge of Antony's plans, but also credible testimony that Antony had indeed been corrupted by Egyptian influence. These weren't enemy propagandists making accusations. These were Antony's own officers, confirming Rome's worst fears about their former commander. The defections revealed a fundamental weakness in Antony and Cleopatra's position. Their vision of a multicultural Eastern Empire was appealing in theory, but it required Romans to accept Egyptian authority over traditionally Roman territories. For many Roman commanders, the cognitive dissonance between serving Rome and serving an Egyptian queen proved impossible to resolve. The campaign itself began promisingly enough. Antony established his main base at Actium, a strategic position on the western coast of Greece that controlled access to the Adriatic Sea. The location offered excellent harbors for their massive fleet, defensible terrain for their army, and the psychological advantage of threatening Italy directly from across the narrow waters. Cleopatra established her own headquarters nearby, bringing with her not only the Egyptian contingent, but also the royal court that had governed Egypt for 2 decades. The presence of Egyptian administrators, priests, and scholars at what was supposed to be a Roman military camp reinforced Octavian's propaganda about Antony's foreign corruption, but it also provided the expertise necessary to manage their complex multinational coalition. The months of preparation at Actium revealed both the strengths and weaknesses of their partnership under extreme pressure. Antony's military experience and personal charisma were essential for maintaining the loyalty of their diverse forces, while Cleopatra's administrative skills and financial resources were crucial for keeping the massive army supplied and organized. But the stress of commanding such an enormous force while facing defections and propaganda attacks began to strain their relationship. Antony, accustomed to the straightforward loyalties of Roman military culture, struggled with the complex political calculations required to hold together their multicultural coalition. Cleopatra, who had spent her entire adult life managing impossible political situations, found herself increasingly frustrated with Antony's tendency toward dramatic gestures rather than careful planning. More dangerously, their presence together in the same camp provided constant ammunition for Octavian's propagandists. Every decision made jointly could be portrayed as evidence of Antony's subordination to foreign influence. Every disagreement could be spun as proof that their alliance was fracturing under pressure. Even their apparent harmony was presented as evidence that Cleopatra had completely bewitched her Roman lover. As Octavian's forces approached and the decisive confrontation became inevitable, Antony and Cleopatra faced the most crucial strategic decision of their lives. They could remain in their defensive positions and force Octavian to attack them on terrain of their choosing, or they could take the offensive and attempt to defeat him before his superior resources could be brought to bear. The decision to fight a naval battle at Actium was influenced by multiple factors, none of them entirely rational. Their fleet was larger and more impressive than Octavian's, suggesting that naval combat would favor their cause. A decisive naval victory would open the route to Italy and allow them to threaten Rome directly. Most appealingly, a spectacular naval triumph would validate their vision of a new kind of empire that could challenge Rome on its own terms. But the decision also reflected the psychological pressure they were under. Months of defections and propaganda attacks had created a siege mentality that made bold action seem preferable to continued defensive waiting. Antony, in particular, was eager to prove that he remained a Roman general capable of decisive action, rather than the Egyptian queen's subordinate that Octavian's propaganda claimed he had become. The Battle of Actium, fought on September 2031 BCE, was one of the most consequential naval engagements in human history, though the tactical details remain disputed by historians. What seems clear is that the massive fleets that had taken years to assemble and position were largely neutralized by a combination of tactical errors, communication failures, and what can only be described as catastrophically bad timing. The battle began promisingly for Antony and Cleopatra's forces. Their larger ships had advantages in close combat, and their initial formation suggested sophisticated tactical planning. But as the engagement developed, several factors combined to transform what should have been a decisive victory into a strategic disaster. The first problem was coordination. Commanding a fleet of 500 ships with crews speaking different languages and following different tactical traditions proved nearly impossible under combat conditions. Orders were misunderstood, formations became confused, and individual captains began making independent decisions that undermined the overall battle plan. More critically, Cleopatra made the decision that would define both her legacy and the future of the ancient world. Whether motivated by tactical calculation or personal panic, she ordered the Egyptian squadron to withdraw from the battle while the outcome was still in doubt. Some sources suggest this was a pre-arranged signal indicating that the battle was lost. Others claim it was an act of cowardice that doomed their cause. Antony's response to Cleopatra's withdrawal sealed their fate. Rather than remaining to rally his forces and possibly salvage the battle, he followed her, abandoning his fleet and army to pursue the woman who had been his partner in reshaping the Mediterranean world. From a military standpoint, it was an incomprehensible decision that turned a possible defeat into a complete disaster. The retreat to Egypt was a nightmare of recrimination, despair, and dawning realization that everything they had worked for had been lost in a single afternoon. Their magnificent fleet was captured or destroyed, their multinational army surrendered or defected, and their vision of an Eastern empire died in the waters off a small Greek town that most people had never heard of. But perhaps most devastating was the psychological impact of their defeat. Antony, who had built his identity around military success and Roman honor, had to face the fact that he had abandoned his men to follow a woman. Cleopatra, who had spent decades preparing for this confrontation, had to accept that all her intelligence, wealth, and political skill had been insufficient to overcome the brutal realities of ancient warfare. As their ship carried them back toward Alexandria, both knew that they were returning not as conquerors, but as the last survivors of a failed revolution. Octavian would follow them to Egypt, and when he arrived, there would be no more chances for dramatic gestures or brilliant strategies. The road to Actium had ended in defeat, and the road from Actium led only to the tomb. The return to Alexandria in the autumn of 31 BCE was perhaps the most painful homecoming in royal history. The city that had sent forth the largest fleet in the ancient world now welcomed back a handful of ships carrying the survivors of the greatest naval disaster since Troy. Cleopatra and Antony, who had departed as divine rulers destined to reshape the Mediterranean, returned as fugitives whose empire had lasted exactly one afternoon. Alexandria itself seemed to reflect their defeat. The city that had gleamed with confidence and prosperity during their preparations now felt hollow and expectant, like a magnificent theatre waiting for a tragedy to reach its inevitable conclusion. The crowds that gathered to witness their return were subdued rather than celebratory, understanding instinctively that they were witnessing the end of an era rather than a temporary setback. The immediate challenge was maintaining the illusion of strength while preparing for the reality of siege. Cleopatra, who had spent her entire adult life managing impossible political situations, threw herself into the task with characteristic intelligence and determination. If Egypt was going to fall, it would fall with dignity, and perhaps there was still a chance, however remote, that skilled diplomacy might achieve what military force had failed to accomplish. Her first priority was negotiating with Octavian, though both sides understood that any talks would be elaborate political theatre rather than genuine diplomacy. Cleopatra had nothing left to offer except Egypt's wealth, Antony's death, and her own submission. And even those concessions might not be sufficient to satisfy a victor who had portrayed her as the enemy of Roman civilization itself. The negotiations, conducted through intermediaries who risked their lives carrying messages between Alexandria and Octavian's advancing forces, revealed the impossibility of Cleopatra's position. Octavian's terms were simple: complete surrender, the execution of Antony, and Cleopatra's transportation to Rome for public humiliation before her inevitable death. In exchange, he offered to spare the lives of her children and perhaps preserve some vestige of Egyptian autonomy under Roman administration. But Cleopatra had not survived 3 decades of Ptolemaic politics to surrender without exploring every possible alternative. While conducting official negotiations with Octavian, she simultaneously pursued secret communications with his subordinates, Roman senators, and Eastern kings who might still be willing to challenge his authority. It was a desperate strategy with virtually no chance of success, but it was also exactly the kind of multifaceted approach that had kept Egypt independent for 2 decades. Her backup plans were characteristic of a ruler who had learned never to rely on single solutions to complex problems. Egyptian ships were prepared for emergency evacuation to Arabia or India, where the Ptolemies still maintained trade relationships that might provide sanctuary. Gold and jewels were distributed to loyal servants, with instructions for establishing Egyptian communities in exile. Most importantly, detailed plans were made for destroying Egypt's accumulated treasure, rather than allowing it to fund further Roman conquests. The treasure threat was Cleopatra's last diplomatic weapon, the promise that Egypt's legendary wealth would be burned rather than surrendered if Octavian's terms were unacceptable. For a Roman commander whose soldiers expected massive rewards for their victory, the prospect of conquering Egypt only to find empty treasuries was genuinely concerning. It was economic warfare disguised as negotiation, and it gave Cleopatra slightly more leverage than her military position might otherwise have warranted. What sustained her through these desperate months was something that would have surprised Roman propagandists, who portrayed her as a foreign oppressor: the genuine loyalty of the Egyptian people. After 2 decades of rule that had brought prosperity, cultural renaissance, and national pride to a kingdom that had been declining for generations, Cleopatra discovered that her subjects were willing to fight for her even when victory was impossible. This loyalty was not merely political, but deeply personal and religious. Cleopatra had succeeded where previous Ptolemaic rulers had failed in becoming genuinely Egyptian rather than merely Greek. Her mastery of Egyptian language and religion, her restoration of ancient temples, and her presentation of herself as the living goddess Isis had created bonds that transcended mere political allegiance. Egyptian priests glared that defending their divine pharaoh was a religious duty that would be rewarded in the afterlife. Merchants organized themselves into militias rather than flee with their wealth. Even ordinary farmers and craftsmen contributed what they could to the city's defenses, understanding that Alexandria's fall would mean the end of Egypt's independence and the beginning of Roman exploitation that would reduce their homeland to a mere province. The contrast with Antony's deteriorating condition could not have been more stark. The man who had once been Rome's most charismatic general was collapsing under the weight of military defeat, political humiliation, and personal despair. His legendary appetite for wine, which had once been seen as evidence of his larger-than-life personality, became a mechanism for avoiding the reality of their situation. Antony's behavior during these final months alternated between grandiose gestures that ignored their desperate circumstances and periods of depression so severe that he could barely function as a military commander. He would spend days planning impossible counterattacks that would somehow reverse their defeat, followed by weeks of drunken withdrawal from all responsibilities. Most painfully for Cleopatra, he seemed incapable of accepting that their shared dream of remaking the ancient world had died at Actium. The practical burden of preparing Alexandria's defenses fell almost entirely on Cleopatra's shoulders. She supervised the construction of new fortifications, organized the distribution of weapons to civilian defenders, and coordinated with naval commanders who were attempting to create a defensive fleet from the scattered remnants of their once mighty armada. Her military preparations were hampered by the same strategic problems that had contributed to their defeat at Actium. Alexandria's defenses had been designed to repel ancient enemies, not Roman legions equipped with the most advanced siege technology in the world. The city's great strength, its position as an island connected to the mainland by a narrow causeway, became a liability when facing an enemy capable of maintaining both land and naval blockades simultaneously. More fundamentally, Egypt lacked the military culture that might have sustained prolonged resistance. Unlike Gaul or Britain, where warrior traditions enabled decades of guerrilla warfare against Roman occupation, Egypt had been peaceful and prosperous for so long that its people were unprepared for the kind of brutal conflict that effective resistance would require. But the most heartbreaking aspect of Cleopatra's final preparations involved decisions about her children that no mother should have to make. Caesarion, now 17 and bearing an unmistakable resemblance to his father, represented both Egypt's dynastic future and its greatest vulnerability. As Julius Caesar's son, he posed a potential threat to Octavian's legitimacy that could never be resolved through negotiation or compromise. Cleopatra's other children, Alexander Helios, Cleopatra Selene, and Ptolemy Philadelphus, were young enough that Octavian might genuinely spare their lives and perhaps even incorporate them into his own family as symbols of his magnanimity. But Caesarion's very existence was a challenge to Octavian's claim to be Caesar's sole heir, making his death almost inevitable, regardless of any agreements that might be reached. The impossible choice facing Cleopatra was whether to send Caesarion away to safety, knowing she would probably never see him again, or keep him in Alexandria to face whatever fate awaited the last pharaoh of Egypt. It was the kind of decision that revealed the human cost of political ambition and the personal tragedy hidden behind historical events. Her solution was characteristically complex and heartbreaking. Caesarion would be sent south toward the Red Sea, with loyal guards and sufficient treasure to establish himself in India or Arabia, where Egyptian trade networks might provide sanctuary. But the departure would be disguised as a religious pilgrimage, allowing both mother and son to maintain the fiction that they would be reunited after the current crisis passed. The final days before Octavian's arrival were marked by a strange combination of frantic preparation and fatalistic acceptance. Cleopatra continued negotiating, planning, and organizing as if victory was still possible, while simultaneously making arrangements that assumed defeat was inevitable. It was the behavior of someone who had learned that hope and realism were not mutually exclusive, and that dignity required fighting until the end regardless of the ultimate outcome. Palace life during this period took on an almost theatrical quality, with courtiers and servants maintaining elaborate ceremonies and protocols even as enemy armies approached the city walls. Cleopatra insisted on regular state dinners, formal audiences, and religious observances, understanding that maintaining royal dignity was both psychologically necessary and politically important for Egyptian morale. When Octavian's advance guard finally appeared outside Alexandria in July of 30 BCE, the city that had once been the intellectual capital of the ancient world prepared for its final siege. The great library, the museum, the palaces that had housed the Ptolemies for 3 centuries, all of it would soon belong to Rome or be destroyed in the fighting. But as Cleopatra stood on the palace balcony watching Roman standards appear on the horizon, she was not the broken foreign seductress of Octavian's propaganda. She was a 40-year-old woman who had ruled Egypt for 19 years, who had preserved its independence longer than anyone thought possible, and who had loved 2 of the most powerful men in history on her own terms rather than theirs. The last pharaoh of Egypt was preparing for her final performance, and she intended it to be worthy of the civilization she had spent her life trying to save. Octavian might conquer Alexandria, but he would discover that defeating Cleopatra required more than military victory. It required understanding that some victories come at a price that makes them indistinguishable from defeat. As July turned to August in 30 BCE, with Octavian's forces tightening their grip around Alexandria, the final negotiations between the last pharaoh of Egypt and the future first emperor of Rome took on the character of a deadly chess game played by masters who both understood that only one could survive. Cleopatra's last diplomatic gambit was as audacious as it was desperate. Rather than continuing to negotiate through intermediaries, she requested a face-to-face meeting with Octavian himself, offering to surrender personally in exchange for guarantees about her children's safety and Egypt's treatment as a Roman province rather than conquered territory. It was a calculated risk that demonstrated either supreme confidence in her persuasive abilities or the recognition that conventional diplomacy had exhausted its possibilities. Octavian's agreement to meet with her revealed his own complex motivations. Politically, he needed Cleopatra alive for his planned triumph in Rome. The woman who had been portrayed as the greatest threat to Roman civilization could not simply disappear without the Roman people witnessing her defeat. Personally, he was curious about the woman who had captivated both Caesar and Antony, wanting to understand whether she possessed genuine charisma or had simply benefited from Roman male gullibility. But before that meeting could take place, Cleopatra faced the most devastating personal loss of her entire life. Mark Antony, driven to despair by military defeat and psychological collapse, took his own life in the traditional Roman manner, falling on his sword in his private chambers while Cleopatra was engaged in negotiations with Octavian's representatives. Antony's suicide was both predictable and tragic, unable to accept the reality of defeat or imagine a future without the power and glory that had defined his identity. He chose death over the humiliation of surrender. His final words, recorded by witnesses, expressed regret not for their shared dreams, but for his failure as a Roman general who had abandoned his soldiers at Actium. For Cleopatra, Antony's death represented more than the loss of a lover or political ally. It was the end of the partnership that had sustained her vision of an independent Eastern empire. Whatever his faults, Antony had been the one Roman powerful enough to challenge Octavian on equal terms, and his death eliminated any remaining hope that Egypt might avoid complete subjugation to Roman rule. Her reaction to the news demonstrated the emotional control that had characterized her entire reign. Rather than collapsing in grief or rage, she immediately began revising her plans to account for the new reality. Without Antony, her negotiations with Octavian would be simpler but infinitely more dangerous. She would be dealing with a victor who no longer needed to consider the possibility of future Roman resistance to his authority. The meeting between Cleopatra and Octavian, when it finally occurred in early August, was one of the most fascinating encounters in ancient history. A confrontation between two of the most intelligent and ruthless politicians of their age, each trying to manipulate the other while fully aware of what their opponent was attempting. Octavian, 23 years old and master of the Roman world, approached the meeting with the confidence of absolute victory, tempered by genuine curiosity about his famous captive. Cleopatra, 40 years old and ruler of a defeated kingdom, came to the encounter with nothing left to lose except her dignity and her children's lives. Contemporary accounts of their conversation are frustratingly brief and probably influenced by later Roman propaganda, but the essential dynamic seems clear. Octavian was testing whether Cleopatra possessed the charisma that had allegedly seduced Caesar and Antony, while Cleopatra was attempting to secure guarantees for her children and perhaps identify weaknesses that might still be exploited. What Octavian discovered was a woman whose intelligence and political sophistication exceeded even his expectations, but whose power to influence events had been completely eliminated by military defeat. Cleopatra was still formidable as an individual, but she was no longer dangerous as a political force. More importantly for his future plans, he realized that her presence in Rome would validate his propaganda claims while posing no actual threat to his authority. What Cleopatra learned from the meeting was infinitely more devastating. Despite Octavian's polite assurances and diplomatic language, she understood with perfect clarity that he intended to transport her to Rome for public display during his triumph before having her executed as the climax of the spectacle. The woman who had ruled Egypt as a goddess would be paraded through Roman streets as a conquered barbarian queen, providing entertainment for crowds who had been taught to see her as the embodiment of foreign evil. The realization that she would be displayed in Rome like a captured animal was intolerable to someone who had spent her entire life carefully managing her public image and political presentation. For Cleopatra, who had always understood that perception was reality in politics, the prospect of being reduced to a Roman trophy was worse than death itself. Her response was to begin planning the most carefully orchestrated suicide in ancient history, a death that would deny Octavian his prize, while ensuring that she died as a pharaoh rather than a prisoner. But even in planning her own death, Cleopatra remained a mother and a queen, making arrangements that would protect her children and preserve what remained of Egypt's dignity. Her final letters, dictated during the last days of August, revealed both her desperation and her enduring political sophistication. To Octavian, she wrote a formal document accepting full responsibility for the war and requesting that she be buried beside Antony with appropriate royal honors. To her children, she left personal messages that combined maternal love with practical advice about surviving in the Roman world they would soon inherit. Most importantly, she spent her final days making detailed arrangements for her children's futures that demonstrated her understanding of Roman politics and Octavian's character. Alexander Helios, Cleopatra Selene, and Ptolemy Philadelphus would be raised in Octavian's household as symbols of his magnanimity, receiving education and treatment appropriate to their royal birth, while being carefully monitored to ensure they posed no future threat to Roman stability. The exact method of Cleopatra's death remains one of history's most debated mysteries, with ancient sources providing contradictory accounts that may reflect political convenience rather than historical accuracy. The famous story of the asp, a venomous snake smuggled into her chambers in a basket of figs, has captured popular imagination for 2 millennia, but faces serious practical objections from modern scholars. Alternative theories suggest she used a fast-acting poison that she had tested on condemned prisoners, or that she was actually murdered by Octavian's agents who then staged her suicide to avoid the political complications of executing such a famous captive. The truth may never be known, but what seems certain is that Cleopatra died on her own terms rather than Octavian's, denying him the satisfaction of publicly executing the woman his propaganda had portrayed as Rome's greatest enemy. The discovery of her body on August 30 BCE, marked the end of the Ptolemaic dynasty after 275 years of rule that had begun when Alexander the Great's general Ptolemy claimed Egypt as his prize. Cleopatra was found lying on a golden couch, dressed in royal regalia and arranged as if she were merely sleeping rather than dead. 2 of her faithful servants, Iris and Charmian, had chosen to die with their queen rather than face life under Roman rule. Octavian's reaction to news of Cleopatra's death was reportedly a mixture of admiration and frustration. He had genuinely respected her intelligence and political skills, but her suicide had deprived him of the spectacular triumph that would have validated his propaganda campaign and demonstrated Rome's complete victory over Eastern resistance. Instead of celebrating the capture of a dangerous enemy, he found himself praising the dignity of a worthy opponent who had chosen death over humiliation. The immediate transformation of Egypt from independent kingdom to Roman province proceeded with the bureaucratic efficiency that characterized Octavian's administration. Egyptian gold began flowing to Rome in unprecedented quantities, providing the financial foundation for the Augustan age that would follow. The ancient temples were preserved but subordinated to Roman religious authority. The Ptolemaic administrative system was largely maintained, but staffed with Roman officials who answered to Roman governors rather than Egyptian pharaohs. Most tragically, the fates of Cleopatra's children fulfilled her worst fears about their futures while confirming her realistic assessment of Roman politics. Caesarion, despite her attempts to send him to safety, was captured during his flight and executed on Octavian's orders. The future emperor could not afford to let Caesar's son survive as a potential rallying point for future rebellions against his rule. Alexander Helios and Ptolemy Philadelphus simply disappeared from the historical record after being taken to Rome, probably dying young in Octavian's household from the combination of poor health and political inconvenience that eliminated inconvenient royal hostages throughout Roman history. Only Cleopatra Selene survived to adulthood, eventually marrying Juba II of Mauritania, and establishing a kingdom that preserved some elements of Ptolemaic culture in North Africa for another generation. But perhaps the most significant casualty of Cleopatra's death was not any individual, but the vision of a different kind of Mediterranean world that she and Antony had tried to create. Their defeat at Actium and her suicide in Alexandria marked the end of the last serious challenge to Roman dominance, and the beginning of an imperial system that would govern the ancient world for the next 5 centuries. The woman who had spoken 9 languages, mastered mathematics and philosophy, and preserved Egypt's independence for 2 decades, died at 39, taking with her the dream of an Eastern empire that could compete with Rome on equal terms. Her death marked not just the end of a dynasty, but the transformation of the Mediterranean from a world of competing civilizations into a Roman lake ruled from a single city. As Octavian stood in the palace where Cleopatra had died, surrounded by the accumulated treasures of 3 centuries of Ptolemaic rule, he had achieved everything he had set out to accomplish. The last pharaoh was dead, Egypt was Roman, and there would be no more Eastern queens threatening the stability of Roman power. But in winning everything, he had also destroyed something irreplaceable: the possibility that the ancient world might have developed along different lines, with Eastern wisdom balancing Western ambition and female intelligence complementing male force. The death of the goddess marked the birth of the empire, but it also marked the end of the dream that power might be shared rather than concentrated, that civilizations might blend rather than conquer, and that a brilliant woman might rule the ancient world as effectively as any man. In killing Cleopatra, whether by asp or poison or simple despair, the ancient world had killed a part of its own potential, leaving only the memory of what might have been, and the eternal question of whether Rome's victory was civilization's gain or its loss. The golden doors of Cleopatra's tomb had barely closed when the rewriting of history began. Octavian, soon to become Augustus Caesar, understood that controlling the narrative was just as important as controlling the narratorian. The woman who had nearly brought Rome to its knees needed to be transformed from a brilliant political adversary into something the Roman people could understand and dismiss, a seductive foreign temptress who had corrupted noble Roman men through sexual manipulation rather than political genius. But first, Octavian had to transform himself. Within 3 years of Cleopatra's death, the young general who had destroyed the last pharaoh would become Augustus, the first Roman emperor. The wealth of Egypt, those legendary treasures that had funded the Ptolemies for 3 centuries, now flowed into Roman coffers, providing the financial foundation for an empire that would last 500 years. Egypt's grain fed Rome's growing population, while its papyrus recorded the laws of Roman bureaucracy. In death, Cleopatra had given Octavian everything he needed to become a god. The Roman historians who followed, Plutarch, Cassius Dio, Suetonius, crafted the version of Cleopatra that most of the world still believes today. They wrote of a woman whose only weapons were beauty and sexuality, who seduced Caesar by hiding in a carpet and enslaved Antony through exotic pleasures and foreign magic. They described elaborate banquets where she dissolved pearls in wine and golden barges that perfumed the very air they passed through. But here's what they didn't want you to know. Not one of these historians was alive when Cleopatra ruled. Not one had access to Egyptian sources or could read hieroglyphics. They were writing Roman propaganda disguised as history, creating a narrative that justified Rome's conquest while diminishing the intelligence and political acumen of the woman who had challenged their empire's dominance. The archaeological evidence tells a very different story. Modern excavations in Alexandria have revealed a sophisticated Hellenistic city with the world's greatest library, advanced engineering, and international commerce. Egyptian papyri show Cleopatra's personal involvement in administrative details, economic policy, and diplomatic correspondence. Temple inscriptions record her religious duties and her fluency in Egyptian. She was the first Ptolemaic ruler in 300 years to actually learn the language of her people. This was no pampered beauty queen playing at politics. The real Cleopatra spoke 9 languages fluently and conducted diplomatic negotiations in Greek, Latin, Arabic, and Egyptian without interpreters. She studied mathematics, philosophy, and rhetoric. She personally managed Egypt's complex economy, from taxation policies to grain distribution to international trade agreements. She understood naval warfare well enough to command ships at Actium, and political strategy sophisticated enough to maintain Egypt's independence for 20 years against Roman pressure. She was, in every sense, the last great pharaoh, a ruler who embodied 3,000 years of Egyptian civilization while adapting to the political realities of the Roman world. Her death didn't just end a dynasty, it marked the end of the Hellenistic period, that remarkable era when Greek culture, Egyptian wisdom, and Eastern traditions had blended to create something entirely new. But why does her story continue to fascinate us 2,000 years later? Perhaps because Cleopatra represents something we've lost and are still searching for, the possibility that power could be exercised with intelligence rather than brute force, that different civilizations could blend rather than conquer each other, and that a brilliant woman could rule as effectively as any man. Every age has reimagined Cleopatra to reflect its own anxieties and aspirations. Shakespeare made her a tragic romantic heroine. Hollywood turned her into a glamorous movie star. Modern feminists have reclaimed her as a powerful female leader who refused to be diminished by male rivals. Each interpretation reveals as much about us as it does about her. The broader significance of her story extends far beyond one woman's rise and fall. Cleopatra's defeat at Actium marked the moment when the Mediterranean world stopped being a collection of competing civilizations and became a Roman lake. The diversity of the Hellenistic kingdoms, with their different languages, religions, and political systems, gave way to Roman uniformity. Local traditions were absorbed into imperial bureaucracy, regional gods were syncretized with Roman deities. The vibrant intellectual exchange between East and West was replaced by the flow of tribute from periphery to center. We can only imagine what might have been if Cleopatra and Antony had won at Actium. Would we have seen a different kind of empire, one that balanced Eastern wisdom with Western ambition? Would the ancient world have developed along more diverse lines, with women playing greater roles in politics and different civilizations maintaining their distinct identities while cooperating as equals? These questions can never be answered, but they remind us that history is not inevitable. The world we inherited was shaped by specific decisions made by specific people at specific moments. Cleopatra's story matters because it shows us that things could have been different, and perhaps in understanding her real achievements and the forces that destroyed them, we can still learn something about the choices we face today. In the end, Cleopatra's greatest victory may be her refusal to be forgotten. Despite 2 millennia of Roman propaganda, despite Hollywood distortions and historical myths, something essential about her story continues to break through. The last pharaoh of Egypt, the woman who spoke 9 languages and ruled with wisdom, who defied Rome and died on her own terms. She remains more fascinating than any fiction, more complex than any legend. Her tomb has never been found, and perhaps that's fitting. Cleopatra belongs not to any single place or time, but to the eternal human story of intelligence confronting power, wisdom challenging force, and the eternal question of what we lose when civilizations collide, and only one survives. In remembering her truly, not as Roman propaganda portrayed her, but as the brilliant ruler she actually was, we honor both history and the possibility that even in defeat, some victories echo through eternity. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the extraordinary life of Cleopatra VII, the last pharaoh of Egypt. I hope this deep dive into her real story has given you a new appreciation for one of history's most remarkable and misunderstood figures. If you enjoyed exploring the truth behind the legend, please consider subscribing to the channel and hitting that notification bell so you won't miss future episodes. Your support means everything and helps me continue bringing you these in-depth historical narratives. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. What surprised you most about the real Cleopatra? Which part of her story resonated with you? And what other historical figures would you like me to explore in future videos? Until next time, keep questioning the stories you've been told, keep digging deeper into history, and remember that the truth is often far more fascinating than any myth. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you in the next episode.